Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 59 and part 2 of our Swashbucklers journey. If you missed the last episode, we covered 4 Pirates of the Caribbean children's books that are illustrated in what I and many Pirates fans call the Swashbucklers art style. Why call it Swashbucklers? Well, it is because at some point in the late 2000s, an animated Pirates of the Caribbean show was supposedly in development. Of course, this show never ended up happening, but if it did, it is highly implied that it would have been named Swashbucklers. You can listen to episode 50 for a lot more background on this art style and the hints of this animated show, but in this episode, we are finally diving back into the world of Pirates of the Caribbean comics. Way back on episodes 16 and 19, I talked about the Pirates comics that predate the Swashbucklers art style's creation. I call this first era of comics the Curse of the Black Pearl era, since they of course came after the first movie and ran from 2003 to 2005, before the Swashbucklers art style took over in 2006 with the release of Dead Man's Chest. There are 24 of these Swashbucklers comics in total, and we'll be covering 12 of them today and the other 12 in the next episode. I'm also splitting these comics up by where they appeared. You see, in contrast to the Curse of the Black Pearl comics, which were all featured in the Disney Adventures magazine, the Swashbucklers comics were split between the Disney Adventures magazine and the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. The unfortunate thing is that the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine was only printed overseas, which means none of the 14 issues of that magazine are in English. No need to worry though, as I have been hard at work on these comics thanks to the people who scanned those magazines years ago, and I have essentially done a full English translation for all of the comics exclusive to that magazine. I'll talk about this more on the next episode, but for today, we are going to focus on the comics found in the Disney Adventures magazine. One more thing I do want to mention, however, is that some of the comics actually appear in both the Disney Adventures magazine and the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. So while this episode will be focusing on the Disney Adventures comics, some of the comics I talk about today have also appeared in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine and vice versa. I split them up into groups of 12 depending on where you would most likely find each comic, and it makes a pretty nice even split. As I said on the last episode, covering the Swashbucklers children's books and now finally these comics has been something I have wanted to do for essentially the entire 3 years that this podcast has been a thing. So without further ado, let's dive back into the world of Swashbucklers and cover the Pirates of the Caribbean comics that you can find in the Disney Adventures magazine. Alright, so we'll start with Breakout, which appeared in the August 2006 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine. It also showed up in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in issue 13, which wasn't until May 2008. But this is the first of multiple comics centering around Pintel and Raggedy, and their journey to where we first see them in Dead Man's Chest. At the start of this comic, we see Pintel and Raggedy in their prison cell on Port Royal, and their cell is being guarded by our other comedic duo, Murtaugh and Mulroy. So let's read this first comic. Alright, so the comic opens with Pintel yelling, "Yeah! I can't take it anymore! My gut is killing me!" And Raggedy says, "Put a sock in it, Pintel. That's the oldest, dumbest escape plan in the world." And Pintel continues with his act here, and he says, "Yeah, it'll work, I say. Oh, the pain. And if you joined in, Raggedy, it would work even better. Oh, somebody, do something, help." And then we see Murtaugh and Mulroy outside the cell, and Murtaugh says, "Hear that? He's been carrying on this way for at least an hour." And Mulroy says, "Pathetic. If he thinks I'm going to open his cell just so I can get conked on the head, he's got another thing coming." And Murtaugh says, "Hey, why the spick and span uniform? You look like a regular dandy, Mulroy." And Mulroy says to him, "Murtaugh, this is just the beginning of my climb to the top. This afternoon, I'm on guard at the governor's mansion. It's my big chance to shine and get on His Excellency's good side. When he gets a load of how dapper I look, I'll be promoted to sergeant in no time. After that, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to lieutenant, and from there, it won't be long before I'm captain of my own brig. and then my own frigate, at which point the Commodore himself will ask me to be his personal advisor on the detachment of His Majesty's fleet in the Caribbean. And Murtaugh says, a truly ingenious plan, though there may be a few snags you haven't considered, like that one there. And he's pointing to something on Mulroy's pants, and Mulroy says, what is it? And Murtaugh says, it's a stain, I'd say. You see sometimes when you brush up against things. And Mulroy runs back into the prison and says, I know what a stain is. And Murtaugh says, no funny business, you two. Mulroy says, I have to get rid of it, or my career is ruined. It's not coming out, it's not coming out. Now what do I do? And then Pintel and Ragetti are watching on from the cell, and Pintel says, and you say I'm theatrical. And Ragetti says, hold on, don't you notice anything odd? And Pintel says, what do you talk? Oh. And they see the dog with the keys in the prison. Then Mulroy runs out and says, I'll go to the inn. Maybe they'll have something to get rid of this stain. Don't let the prisoners out of your sight. And Murtaugh says, you can count on me, old Eagle Eyes Murtaugh. And while they're doing that, Ragetti is trying to get the dog to come over, and he says, here, doggy, come here. That's a good boy. And then we go to later that night. They get the keys from the dog, and they open up the cell door, and Pintel says, the coast is clear. Those keys really did the trick. Let's head that way. And Ragetti goes the opposite way and says, okay. And now they're both separated, and Pintel says, that you, Ragetti? And then Ragetti says, that you, Pintel? I think there's someone round the corner. And Ragetti bumps into a load of barrels, and they find each other, and Pintel says, I can't believe it. You're a walking disaster. And then out of nowhere, Murtaugh and another soldier come in and say, stop right there, you slippery snakes. And Pintel says, me and my big mouth. Alright, so that was Breakout. Pintel and Ragetti's first attempt at breaking out of prison, of course, ends up failing, and this will lead into a comic later on when they do actually escape. But this one is pretty fun as it shows both Pintel and Ragetti and Murtaugh and Mulroy, so we get both of the duos together. This is also the first of multiple comic appearances for the prison dog, who of course is with Pintel and Ragetti in Dead Man's Chest. I especially love Mulroy's plan to rise through the ranks of the Navy, simply because he has one guard shift at the governor's mansion. I think that's pretty funny. But there's not much else to say on this one, so let's move on to the next comic, which is named Double Duel. This appeared in the September 2006 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine, as well as the 13th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in May 2008, and it features both Jack Sparrow and Will Turner. The two of them are on Tortuga and have been cornered by a group of pirates who all just happen to be angry with Jack Sparrow, of course. So let's dive into this comic. Alright, so the comic begins with a narration that says, Trouble has a way of finding Captain Jack Sparrow. But tonight, Jack and Will Turner seem to have found it, in Tortuga. And Will says, well, Captain, I gather you were wrong when you said we wouldn't run into any problems. And Jack says to Will, problems? What problems? I see no problems here. And then we get some dialogue from the pirates trying to fight them, and it says, Jack Sparrow, you owe me 70 doubloons and a shilling. And then another pirate says, best pay up that roast pig of mine you made off with last May, Captain Sparrow. And Jack says to Will, define problems. And Will says, what say you define solution? And Jack says, I've never been very good at defining things. And Will says, I thought not. And then they begin fighting with these pirates, and one of them says to Jack, you stole my cutlass. And Jack says to him, I did nothing of the sort. I merely borrowed it to carve up this here chap's roast swine. And then we go over to Will, and one of the pirates says to him, your friend Jack sailed off with me boat. And Will says, why am I not surprised? Still, Captain Sparrow's affairs have nothing to do with me, so why don't we call a truce? And then the pirates keep fighting Will, so he says, guess not. And then Jack calls down to Will, how are you faring, young William? And Will says, a better question might be why I allow you to drag me into your messes. And then Jack says, oh, come now, you're here of your own accord. Oops, watch your footing, mate. And one of the pirates he's fighting falls off these wooden beams they're standing on. And then Will says, see, you never play fair. You just push that chap off his perch. Now me, I fight by the rules. And while Will is saying this, he's currently cutting these lines that are right next to these two pirates, essentially tangling them up in the lines. And he says, we'll get you yet. Hold still, boy. And then another pirate comes rushing right behind Will. And Will says, oh, great. And he kicks the guy right in the face. And after all the pirates are defeated, Jack says, don't think I didn't see that, William. You said you fight by the rules, but you kicked that last scoundrel square in the jaw. And Will says, No, I fought by the rules through and through. And Jack says, Oh, really? Which rules were those? And then Will says, Why, yours, of course. And that is the end of Double Duel. So this is a pretty fun one with Jack and Will fighting off these pirates, and it shows Will embracing more of the pirate within him as he begins to fight dirtier and dirtier as the comic goes on. Not much else to talk about with this one, but it is a super fun comic nonetheless. Next up we have one of the longer comics, and this one is super interesting for something we'll see in a little bit. But this comic is called The Compass of Destiny, and it also appeared in both the Disney Adventures magazine and the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine. It was split into 3 parts in the Disney Adventures magazine, and part 1 appeared in the October 2006 issue, then part 2 in the November 2006 issue, and part 3 in the December-January 2007 issue. In the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, the whole thing appeared in issue 3 in November 2006. If you couldn't guess from the title of this comic, it of course has to do with Jack Sparrow, and he starts this comic by helping a man named Admiral Royce try and locate Tia Dalma. So let's go see what happens. Alright, so the comic begins with more narration, and the narrator says, At the mouth of the Pantano River, Captain Jack Sparrow ferries the mysterious Admiral Royce and his crew toward the thick swampland. And Jack says, Here we are, mates. Just up the road, quick left, and you're at the bayou shack of the beautifully odd Tia Dalma. And Royce says to Jack, I am no fool, Jack Sparrow. I know the mystic is not so easy to find. Let us bargain. You get this 15-pound sack of gold, and in return I am shown the way. And Jack says, I enter this agreement with a note of caution. There is no guarantee we will find Tia Dalma. To do so, you'll need a lot of help. And Royce says, I have all the help I need right here. A map to show the way. But I still need someone who knows this land well. And Jack says, and that's where I come in, eh? And Royce says, precisely. Now, there should be a stone idol here. Here we have it, mates. One giant stone idol. And then one of Royce's crewmen says, and here's the cursed snake pit, Admiral. And Royce says, never mind it. We must not waste... And he sees a skull impaled on a spear. And he says, this is not on the map. And one of his crewmen says, it's a sign. And Jack says, and I would wager that whoever's trying to send this eerie message is telling us to keep out. And out of nowhere, a bunch of natives come and ambush them. And Jack says, see, what did I tell you? No one ever listens to me. And Royce yells, ambush! And the natives say, who dares trespass here? Seems you have something that belongs to us, and you will give it back. And Jack says, sorry mate, but I've got a 15-pound bag of gold riding on this. And while Royce is fighting this one native, another one grabs the map out of his other hand, and he yells, no! And one of Royce's crewmen says, they're retreating! And Royce yells, they've got the map! After them! And then out of nowhere, we see a whole bunch of arrows come raining down on them, and that is the end of part 1, if you're reading this in Disney Adventures magazine. But we're going to move on to part 2. So the arrows rain down, and Jack takes cover. And the narration says, when we last saw Captain Jack Sparrow, he was leading Admiral Royce to Tia Dalma, the mystic, for a hefty sack of gold. But it looks like their trip isn't going well as planned. So after all the arrows come down, one of Royce's last remaining crewmen says, most of our men are down with paralyzing darts. They won't recover for hours, sir. And Royce yells, the fools! Standing there in harm's way. Without men or the map, we are lost. And Jack says, how soon you forget why you paid a pretty doubloon to bring me along, Royce. And Jack says to himself, never needed that map to begin with, to tell the truth. Though it was fun to watch you all jump through hoops. And then we see Jack reaches Tia Dalma, and Tia Dalma says, Jack Sparrow, it has been a while. And Jack says, I hate it when you do that eyes in the back of your head thing. And Royce says, Tia Dalma? You're coming with us. One Lord Cutler Beckett has sent us to retrieve you. And Jack says, Beckett, just one moment, mate. Let me handle this. And Royce looks to his men and says, Captain Sparrow really does think I'm a fool. And then Royce turns to Jack and says, so far you've been extremely helpful. Continue to collaborate and you shall be well compensated. Turn against us and you're finished. Savvy, mate? And Jack says, savvy enough, except there's one small detail. And Jack pulls out his sword and says, our collaboration has come to an abrupt end. Sorry. Had I previously known you were in the service of the vile Lord Beckett, I never would have collaborated in the first place. And Royce says, what a shame. If you don't give us the soothsayer, we'll take her. And Royce continues and says, Captain Jack Sparrow, I'm afraid you've finally met your match. And Tiadama says, ah, that's where you're mistaken. I have completed my spell. And it is you who has met your match. And then we see a bunch of zombies coming out of the woods. And they all come down on Royce and his men. But while the rest of Royce's men are distracted by the zombies, Royce goes right for Tiadama, and that is the end of part 2. But we then move over into part 3. If you're reading this comic in the Disney Adventures magazine, there is a catch-up page right at the beginning of part 3. But the story picks up with Jack intervening right before Royce can strike Tiadama. And he says, not a good idea, Royce. I should have known you worked for the East India Trading Company. You're all the same, slimy and untrustworthy, more dishonest than any pirate, and lousy swordsman. And Royce says, and yet I've certainly put you on the spot, eh? And Jack says, oh, have you? And Jack ducks out of the way right for a zombie to jump right at Royce. And all the zombies jump on Royce and pretty much kill him. And after that whole debacle is over with, Tiadama says, you have my thanks, Jack Sparrow, as well as my fury. After all, you did lead them here. And Jack says, oh, get over it. Besides, I only did it to hitch a ride here to you. I'm looking for something I believe you have. And Tiadama says, I know what you come for, Jack Sparrow. That sack of gold you are holding is more valuable than you think. Give it to me and I will give you something back, something you will want. And Jack says, consider the gold yours. And Tiadama picks up something from her table and says, then consider this yours. It is a compass, unlike any other. Whatever it is you most desire, the needle will point the way. Use it wisely. And Jack picks it up and says, when have I ever not used something wisely, madam? And Tiadama then says, well, there was that time with the leaky boat and the Admiral's jade statue, and lest we forget that cursed sword. And Jack says, touché. And Tiadama says, farewell, Jack Sparrow. And then we go over to Jack telling this story in a tavern on Tortuga. And he says, until we meet again, she said. And one of the pirates says, incredible. And then Gibbs asks Jack, if anyone can keep spirits up, it's you, Captain. But tell me, where do you come up with these tales? And Jack pulls out the compass and says, tales, Mr. Gibbs. Who's telling tales? And that is the end of the Compass of Destiny. So let's first talk about the elephant in the room and why this comic is called The Compass of Destiny. This is where Jack Sparrow gets his compass from Tiadama. Now, while this does fit with what we know from Dead Man's Chest, where we find out from Tiadama that Jack got the compass from her, there is one problem here. Obviously, this comic is set before The Curse of the Black Pearl, as Jack has the compass in the first movie. But what has now become an issue is the time when Jack gets his compass. Earlier this year, we covered the book The Price of Freedom, and in that book, that is of course when Jack Sparrow is still working for the East India Trading Company before he truly becomes a pirate. Even while he's working for the EITC, he actually has the compass throughout The Price of Freedom. We don't know when he got it from her, but him bartering for the compass happened probably even before he started working for the EITC. In this comic, Jack is obviously a pirate, and that sets this later in the timeline when Jack technically should have the compass by now. Obviously, this is only an issue now because The Price of Freedom released years after this comic did, so back in 2006, this was a perfectly fine explanation. But I love The Price of Freedom, so while this is a great story of how Jack gets his compass, I don't fully consider this comic canon. However, at the end of this comic, we see that Jack was telling the story to Gibbs and some other pirates. So we could then say that this story was embellished by Jack to tell other people the tale. It makes a lot of sense actually when you think about it, and it keeps the real story of how Jack acquired the compass from Tiadama a secret known only to him. That totally makes sense with someone like Jack Sparrow. But now there is something else mentioned at the end of this comic, as when Tiadama says, well, there was that time with the leaky boat and the Admiral's jade statue, and lest we forget, that cursed sword. Now what I want to point out is that the cursed sword Tiadama is referring to is none other than the Sword of Cortez. If you remember from the Young Jack Sparrow series, at the end of the 4th book, which is called The Sword of Cortez, Jack and the crew of the Barnacle visit Tiadama, and give the Sword of Cortez to her so she can keep it safe. This little reference here in this comic can be easily missed, but I love it. I love any connection to the Young Jack Sparrow series, so that is super, super cool. But let's now move on to the next comic, which is named A Mysterious Light, and this appeared in the February 2007 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine. It also appeared in the 14th and final issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in June 2008. But this comic is neat because it centers around Jack Sparrow and Elizabeth Swann, and specifically takes place during the events of the Curse of the Black Pearl. Jack and Elizabeth have just been marooned by Barbossa on Rum Runner's Isle, which is the name of that island in the film if you didn't know. But night has fallen and Elizabeth notices an eerie green light coming from the trees. So let's go and see what happens. So the comic begins with the narration, "Marooned! Jack Sparrow and Elizabeth Swann are stuck on this lonely scrap of an island, and it looks like they're not alone." So Elizabeth says to Jack, "We must find out what that light is." And Jack says to her, "Chase weird lights through yonder dark and creepy jungle? No thank you." And Elizabeth says, "There may be other people on this island." And then Jack says, "What say I stand guard over the campfire, or better yet, lay down near it and get some sleep?" And Elizabeth says, "Oh, nobody is as stubborn as a pirate." And Jack says, "I can't deny that one, love." So Elizabeth gets angry with Jack and sets off on her own, and she says, "I'll go by myself then." And Jack says, "Fine, suit yourself." So we then cut to Elizabeth in the woods, and she says, "I know there's a good man inside that pirate somewhere, but I'm beginning to think he'll never find his way out." And then she finds the source of the green light, and she says, "Fireflies. It was only a nest of..." And then out of nowhere, the tree she's looking at comes to life, and the tree creature yells out, "Do you know why there is no one living on a beautiful island like this? It's because of me. Don't fear. You know what they say about us tree spirits. Our bark is worse than our bite. Ha 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 ha. Now let's see if that part about my bite is true." And he grabs Elizabeth's wrist, and the fireflies make her essentially pass out. And out of nowhere, Jack grabs her hand and says, "Milady, may I take your hand?" And he pulls Elizabeth away from the tree monster, and he says, "And you, I think I'll take your hand off." And he cuts off the tree creature's hand. And the tree monster says, "You fool! Don't you know who you're dealing with?" And he knocks Jack and Elizabeth away. And Jack says, "Actually, I don't think I have the slightest idea." And Jack grabs Elizabeth's torch and he says, "Perhaps I should shed some light on the matter." And he throws the torch right at the tree monster, setting him on fire. And Jack says, "Oh, and in case you are wondering who you are dealing with, the name is Captain Jack Sparrow." And then as the tree monster burns to smithereens, he says, "This isn't over. As long as a tree grows in this world, I'll be back." And after he is gone, Elizabeth says to Jack, "I'm not going to thank you if that's what you're waiting for." And Jack says, "Now who's being stubborn?" And that is the end of A Mysterious Light. So we see Jack and Elizabeth encounter this tree spirit that apparently dwells on Rum Runner's Isle. And something that I noticed while I was researching all these comics is the fact that there's actually some interesting differences in this comic depending on where you read it. The one I just read is the Disney Adventures magazine version, but if you read the comic in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, which as I said earlier is not in English, there are actually multiple additions to the story. First up, at the beginning, Elizabeth tells Jack that she does not trust pirates, and that Jack should remember to refer to her as Miss Swan. But once Elizabeth encounters the tree spirit, in this version we actually find out the creature's name is Burgess, and apparently he was a man who was also marooned on the island long ago and fell under a curse while he was there. He tells Elizabeth that she will share his fate, but then of course Jack arrives to save the day. And at the end of that version of the comic, Elizabeth apologizes to Jack for what she said to him earlier, and Jack tells her that she has more pirate in her blood than she wants to think. So these are all really cool additions, and it makes me wonder why these weren't in the Disney Adventures version. I wonder if they were cut or added during the translation process, since there's no additional art in that version, it's just the dialogue is different. But I guess we'll never find out what the reasoning behind that was. Regardless of version, this comic is super cool and especially neat since it takes place during the Curse of the Black Pearl. Next up we have our second Pintel and Ragetti comic, and this one is called Pearly Gaze. This only appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine, and it was in the March 2007 issue. This comic is actually set after Pintel and Ragetti escape prison, and while yes, there is a comic detailing their escape, which we will cover in a bit, this comic does come first in the publication order, so we're going to cover this one first. Pintel, Ragetti, and of course the prison dog are in a rowboat looking for the Black Pearl, and they come across a mysterious hut filled to the brim with pearls. So let's dive into this one. So the comic starts out with Pintel saying, "Keep looking, Ragetti. The Black Pearl has to be on one of these islands." And Ragetti says, "I think the dog has spotted something in that bay over there." And they pull up to a little shack that's on the coast of this island. And they get out of the boat, and Ragetti says, "Whoever lives here may have seen the pearl." And Pintel says, "You go up there. See if they're friendly." And Ragetti looks up and sees some tribal masks and some sea creature jaws that are on the side of the hut. And he says, my guess would be that they are most certainly not friendly." But they go inside, and Pintel says, "Maybe not, but they've got pearls. Lots and lots of pearls." And Ragetti says, "Since we can't find the Black Pearl, I suggest we help ourselves to some of these nice white ones." And they start looting all these pearls, and Pintel says, "Aye, forget the Black Pearl. With all this loot, we could buy a dozen ships. We could be kings." And Ragetti says, "And what would be your first royal command, King Pintel?" And Pintel says, "I'd have all the no-good pirates like us locked up, so they couldn't steal from me." And Ragetti says, "I wish I had two good eyes, so that I could see this little beauty better." "Say, that gives me an idea." And Ragetti pulls out his fake eye and puts it in this clamshell, and he puts the pearl in his eye socket. And Pintel asks, "And what would your first royal command be, King Ragetti?" And Ragetti says, "I would order a holiday named for me, Ragetti Day. Everyone loves a holiday, so they'd all love me. People would dance and feast in my name. Maybe they'd wear paper costumes and balance fruit on their heads." And then they hear the dog barking from outside, and Pintel says, "Uh-oh, something's wrong." And we see the natives that own the hut are coming back. And Ragetti says, "Those must be the owners of the pearls. We'll have to fight if we want to be kings, Pintel." And Pintel says, "They don't just look unfriendly, they look ferocious. Better to be a pirate with empty pockets than a king with a chest full of arrows and spear tips." And both of them get back in the boat and begin to row away. And Pintel says, "Row! Row as if your life depended on it." And Ragetti says, "What do you mean, as if?" And then we cut to a little bit later, and Pintel is exhausted and says, "It looks like we lost them. But we've also lost all those lovely pearls." And Ragetti says, "Not all. I've still got one." And he shows Pintel the pearl he put in his eye socket. And Pintel says, "Well done, Ragetti. If we're clever, we could use the value of that one pearl to build ourselves a fortune. It all starts with this one lucky pearl." And he slaps Ragetti on the back, and the pearl pops out of Ragetti's eye and falls into the ocean. And Ragetti says, "Easy come, easy go," I says. And Pintel says, "No talking. I don't want to hear a single word. I'm too depressed." And the dog barks behind him, and Pintel says, "That goes for you too, dog." And that is the end of Pearly Gaze. Nothing too crazy going on here, but it is a fun comic that shows Pintel and Ragetti almost becoming rich beyond measure, and then of course losing it all. And I just love the moment where Pintel slaps Ragetti on the back, which pops the pearl out of his eye. It's so funny. And overall, a great little Pintel and Ragetti adventure. And I also love how Pintel was ready to build up a fortune, invest the one pearl that Ragetti still had to build all this wealth. It really speaks to like their intelligence that you kind of see in certain points in the first three movies, how they are kind of more intelligent than they seem. But this is a great comic overall. Now we're going to move on to Curses, which appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine in the May 2007 issue. Now, while this did not appear in the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, it did appear somewhere else, that being in an action figure 2-pack. If you recall, the company Zizzle produced all the Pirates toys for Dead Man's Chest and At World's End, and they of course made all the incredible action figures. And while they made action figures for both of the movies, there was also a line with the tagline Secrets of the Deep, and these included either exclusive characters or variants of other characters, and most of them came with cool little coins that had the corresponding character depicted on it. There were a whole bunch of figures in this series, but there were 3 action figure 2-packs in the Secrets of the Deep line that contained what was called an exclusive comic. However, these comics weren't really exclusive as they adapted comics from the Disney Adventures magazine. But while the story of the comic is the same, the only difference is the fact that all of the characters in the comic are replaced with the action figure version of that character. They are very funny to look at, in my opinion, but they are super charming and definitely a product of its time. As I said, this variant of Curses came in a 2-pack of Jack Sparrow and Elizabeth Swann action figures, which were 2 exclusive variants of them, along with 2 accessories that are featured in the comic. But the comic was renamed to The Haunting of Jack Sparrow for the action figure version, which is the only change besides it featuring action figures instead of illustrated characters. This also happened with 2 other comics, those being Jailbreak in a set of Pintel and Ragetti, and Beast Ship in a pack of Will Turner and Davy Jones. But I'll talk more about those packs when we get to those comics later in the episode. I just wanted to mention this in case any of you might remember owning these figure 2-packs and these versions of the comics. I do own the 2-pack of Jack and Elizabeth that features the Curses variant comic, but I need to see if I still have the actual comic somewhere. I know I have the figures, but I need to see if I have the comic lurking somewhere in my collection. But to get back to the actual comic here, it takes place during the events of Dead Man's Chest, specifically after the Black Pearl leaves Tortuga with Elizabeth and Norrington. While Norrington is not in this comic, it is implied that this comic takes place at that part of the film. But Jack Sparrow wakes up and notices that he has become cursed once again, and has turned into a skeleton just like he did under the Aztec Gold's curse. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into Curses. So the comic begins with Jack looking in the mirror, and he sees he is now a skeleton again. And he says, "Oh no, not again!" And then the narration says, "Somewhere at sea aboard the Black Pearl, Captain Jack Sparrow has awoken from a troubled sleep to make a shocking discovery." And Jack hears knocking on the captain's cabin door, and it's Elizabeth on the other side. And she says, Jack, it's Elizabeth. Are you awake?" And Jack runs to his bed and covers himself under the covers. And he says, "No, I most certainly am not awake. I am currently in a very, very deep sleep and must not be disturbed." But regardless of what Jack just said, Elizabeth still barges in and she says, "The Pearl's headed for rough weather, Jack. You're needed on deck to help batten down the hatches." And Jack says, "No, it's my spine. I'm having some trouble with it, you see. All of my bones, actually." And Elizabeth says, "But your crew needs its captain." And Jack says, "Keep your distance, love. My condition might be contagious." And Elizabeth yells, "Fine, stay in bed. I'll just get the ship prepared myself." And she leaves Jack alone in the captain's cabin. But Jack noticed that the necklace she's wearing is glowing. So he says, "The necklace. That bauble I gave to Elizabeth is part of the Pelagostos treasure. Just like my dagger. They must be cursed. Clearly I shouldn't have borrowed them during my brief reign as the Pelagostos chief. Who knew they'd make me all bony, just like that Aztec gold once did? I'd better get rid of said artifacts and hope that it makes me fleshy once more. I must get that pendant from Elizabeth before she becomes all bony as well." But then we go on deck on the Black Pearl, with Elizabeth giving orders to the crew. And she says, "Haul those sheets in, mates. Make fast the topgallants." And Jack sneaks out of his captain's cabin and says, "I have to be sneaky about this. If Elizabeth finds out I stole that necklace for her, she's likely to be even more angry with me than usual." And he gets very close to Elizabeth and says, "Just a little closer." And then Elizabeth feels his hand on her back and she elbows him away and she says, "Don't you dare." And Jack says, "Ugh, so much for the sneaky approach." And all the pirates then converge on Jack, pointing their swords at him. And Jack says, "Don't be hasty, mates, if you'll just give me a moment to explain." And all the pirates say, "It's one of Barbossa's cursed skeleton crew. I thought they were all back to normal. Barbossa's monkey is still a skeleton. Maybe he's a big monkey." And then Elizabeth yells, "Get him!" And they all chase after Jack. And he says, "Explain! I'm trying to explain." And Elizabeth says, "Explain it to the point of my sword, you scurvy skeleton." And then Jack makes it up to the mast and he yells down, "Pintel, Ragetti, have a little sympathy. You were cursed once." And Pintel says, "Being cursed don't make you sympathetic." And Ragetti says, "Mostly it just makes you itchy all over." And Jack says, "Wait a minute, I'm not just some scurvy skeleton." And the pirates converge on Jack on the mast and they say, "We've got you now." And Jack jumps off the mast and yells, "I'm Captain Jack Sparrow, and it's high time I started acting like it." And one of the pirates says, "He don't seem to know we've got him." And Jack yells down, "I want that necklace you're wearing, my bunny lass." And he looks down at Elizabeth and sees her turning into a skeleton, but she doesn't realize it, and she yells up to him, "Try to take it, you scurvy skeleton!" And he swoops down and yanks the necklace off her neck and says, "So I shall, and stop calling me that." And Jack swings over the stern of the Black Pearl, and Gibbs yells, "He's swinging overboard." And Marty says, "I'd leave too if she called me scurvy all the time." But we see Jack lands on the back of the Black Pearl right on his window. And he says, "Not quite overboard, mate. But overboard is exactly where these rotten things are going." And he throws the dagger and the necklace off the ship. Then soon after, we see Jack has returned to his normal state. And Elizabeth barges into the captain's cabin and yells, "Jack!" And Jack says, "Right here, in the flesh, I'm happy to say." And Elizabeth tells him, "A skeletal pirate got on board and stole my necklace." And Jack says, "That's the problem with fancy jewels. You're constantly worried about losing them. They're really sort of a curse, don't you think?" And that is the end of Curses. And this one is super fun, and one that I especially have a lot of nostalgia for, as I have owned this Disney Adventures issue for as long as I can remember, and distinctly remember reading this comic over and over when I was a kid. But as we saw, Jack turned into a skeleton because of a dagger and necklace he stole from the Pelagostos treasure. These two items were enchanted and turned the people who took them into skeletons, just like the Aztec gold did. However, a key difference here is that this curse doesn't only make you a skeleton in the moonlight, as Jack is a skeleton even in his captain's cabin. Also, something interesting is that Pintel and Ragetti are mentioned here in this comic, and Jack calls out to them asking for sympathy. And what is odd is that in the normal version of the comic, which I just read, Pintel and Ragetti seem to be depicted as random pirates, whereas in the version of the comic in the Secrets of the Deep action figure pack, it does actually have Pintel and Ragetti, or more specifically, their action figures in that comic panel. Kind of odd that they aren't depicted in the normal version here, even though they are mentioned by name and they actually have dialogue. Very strange, but overall, this is one of my favorite comics because of the nostalgia I have for it, and it is also just a super fun one. But next up is Jailbreak, another Pintel and Ragetti comic, and the one where they successfully escape prison. This appeared in the June 2007 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine, and also has an action figure version of it called The Escape of Pintel and Ragetti in the Secrets of the Deep 2-pack. The figures in that pack are of course Pintel and Ragetti, but they are also exclusive variants of the figures, with each of them wearing parts of Jack Sparrow's outfit as a disguise. While Pintel and Ragetti do steal some other prisoners' gear in the comic, as we'll see in a second, they don't put anything on as a disguise, and especially none of the stuff they take is anything resembling Jack Sparrow's clothes. I think it was just a fun idea for variants of the figures, but regardless, the figures are super cool, as Pintel has Jack's hat and jacket on, and Ragetti is wearing Jack's bandana. But let's go into the comic and see how Pintel and Ragetti finally escape prison. So the comic begins with Pintel saying, "Well, Ragetti, that's another one down." And Ragetti says, "We'll run out of room on the wall soon." And Pintel says, "That makes 6 failed escape attempts just this week." And Ragetti says, "You said breaking out was going to be easy, Pintel. We'll be gone in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail was what you said." "Well, if the lamb was here right now, I'd eat it, tail and all. I've had nothing but porridge for months." And we go outside of their cell and we see Murtagh and Mulroy settling down for a nice piece of roast mutton. And they say, "That roast mutton looks delicious." And Mulroy says, "Another glorious day in the army. Every meal is a banquet, every formation is a parade." And Murtagh says, "Didn't I tell you to keep that mutt out of here while we're eating?" And we see, of course, the prison dog is here again. And they say to him, "Be gone, dog. The best you'll get is table scraps, if there are any." The dog, of course, begins to bark a little, and Pintel says, "Huh? What was that?" And they see the dog come up to their cell, and he says, "It's that nice doggy that always has the keys to the cell in his mouth." And Ragetti says, "Just once I wish we could convince him to give us those keys. Surely 2 smart blokes like us can think of some clever plan to..." And then we see out of nowhere, the dog runs up and drops the keys in their cell out of nowhere. And Ragetti says, "What do you know? The plan worked." And Pintel says, "What plan? He just dropped them inside the cell." So the two of them sneak out of their cell while Murtagh and Mulroy are chowing down on their meal. And Ragetti sees the roast mutton and he says, "Look at that! Roast mutton!" And Pintel says, "Shh! Quiet now! We'll tiptoe past." And then we see Ragetti steps on Pintel's foot, and they both yell out and make noise, and Pintel says, "You're tiptoeing on my toes, you clod!" And that, of course, alerts Murtaugh and Mulroy, and Mulroy says, "The prisoners are trying to escape." And Murtaugh says, "Oh, not again." So Pintel and Ragetti begin to run away from Murtaugh and Mulroy chasing them. And Ragetti says, "They're onto us. Run!" And Pintel says, "Run, after you crushed my foot?" And Ragetti then says, "Hop, then hop." And we see the prison dog grabs the roast mutton from the table after Murtaugh and Mulroy begin chasing them. And Ragetti sees this and he says, "You know, I think that dog helped us escape so he could get at that fine leg of mutton." And Pintel says, "You're daft. Remember my plan. We need to get across the battlements, then down the hill to the docks." And Ragetti says, "Then we steal a boat and head for open water." And Pintel says, "Wait a minute, this ain't the battlements. How do we end up back in the guard room?" And Ragetti says, "I knew you was up to something, dog. Gimme, gimme." And he tries to grab the roast mutton from the prison dog. And Pintel says, "While we're here, let's help ourselves to some of this fine gear taken from the prisoners. Ragetti, quit playing with that dog." And Ragetti is still trying to get the roast mutton from the prison dog. And he says, "I'm not going anywhere without this." But soon after, Pintel, Ragetti, and the prison dog are outside. And Pintel says, "We're out." And Ragetti says, "This is it. The plan is working this time. We really are going to halt." And they're stopped by Murtaugh and Mulroy. And Mulroy says, "Time to march right back into your cell like good little prisoners." And Ragetti grabs the mutton away from the dog finally and says, "Yes, it's mine. Look, Pintel, I finally got the mutton." And Murtaugh says, "Hey, isn't that our mutton?" And Mulroy says, "They stole our dinner." And they say, "Let's get 'em." And Ragetti yells out, "Run!" And Pintel says, "The dog! Watch out for the... ah!" And they trip over the prison dog and they fall off the cliff. And Pintel says, "This'll be the most amazing escape plan ever, if we can survive it." And the two of them then fall into a cart, and Ragetti kicks the barrel away that was holding it in place, and both of them begin to tumble down the hill. But we see Murtaugh and Mulroy looking down from the side of the fort, and Mulroy says, "We could follow them over." And Murtaugh says, "Are you mad? Let's pretend to look for them over on the other side of the fort." And Mulroy says, "Right." So they both go away, and Pintel and Ragetti are now flying down the hill in this cart. And the prison dog jumps off the fort as well to join them. And Ragetti says, "Pintel, we're moving." And Pintel says, "Right, it's part of the plan." And Ragetti says, "At this point, I'm really starting to hate this plan." And we see them barreling down to the docks, and all the soldiers begin to make a barricade of barrels. And they all say, "You there, halt! Please, barricade the docks." And Ragetti says, "We're out of control. I wish we were back in our nice, cozy cell right now." And Pintel says, "Anything would be better than this. We're rolling right through. I think we're going to make it." And then the cart knocks into a cannon, and they all fly out of the cart. And Pintel says, "Never mind, we're not going to make it." And Ragetti says, "Not through a cannon, no." And they both, of course, fall right into a rowboat. And the fisherman on the dock says, "Hey, come back with my boat." And Ragetti and Pintel both notice they are now in a boat. And they're like, "Boat, boat." And of course, soon after, they have now escaped. And Pintel says, "Now that was a clever escape plan. And we got away with all that gear we pinched from the jail." And of course, the prison dog is with them because the prison dog made it into the boat as well. And Ragetti says, "Not to mention the nicest bit of food we've had in months." And the dog sees the roast mutton in Ragetti's hand and eats the entire thing. And Ragetti says, "No, not fair." And Pintel is annoyed at this, and that is the end of Jailbreak. So this one is super fun, and what I forgot to mention earlier, and of course you saw in the comic, is that Murtaugh and Mulroy are also present here, which is awesome. Neither of their names are ever said by any character, which is weird, but it is definitely them, as they are depicted in the same way that they are in the other comics they appear in. But this comic obviously is when Pintel and Ragetti finally escape, and Ragetti said at the beginning that they have been in prison for months at this point, and they have tried to escape 6 times in the last week, which is hilarious. But at the end of the comic, they of course end up in the rowboat with the prison dog, which of course leads directly into the 2 comics set after this one, being Pearly Gaze, which we already talked about, and another one called The Sleeping Island, which we'll cover in the next episode. Those 2 comics take place in the gap of time between Pintel and Ragetti's escape in this comic and when they show up in Dead Man's Chest looking for the Black Pearl. But let's move on to the next comic, which is named Legends Lost. This appeared only in the Disney Adventures magazine in the September 2007 issue, and for a while, this comic was not available online anywhere. So that led me to buying this specific Disney Adventures issue so I could read it. This, of course, was way back in 2023 when I bought it, but it was later uploaded in late 2024 by a fantastic Tumblr blog named Disney Adventures Mailbox, which I want to give a massive shout out to. This blog has been archiving essentially everything from the Disney Adventures magazine, from comics to articles to advertisements, literally everything that ever appeared in the magazine. It is a fantastic resource and has been incredibly helpful in locating some of these Pirates comics. So if you want to check it out, you can go to their Tumblr blog, which is DA Mailbox, or you can go to damailbox.tumblr.com, which is the website for their whole archive, and there you can see everything that has been archived so far. They have tons of comics on there, not just Pirates comics, but tons of other stuff from various issues as well. It's all well cataloged too, so you can pick a specific issue and see everything from that issue that's been archived, or you can pick a specific franchise and see everything they have archived, from comics to advertisements, interviews, anything with that tag. So if you're interested in the Disney Adventures magazine, please go check it out. But anyway, let's get back to Legends Lost. This comic is very cool, and it revolves around Jack Sparrow and the crew of the Black Pearl searching for the legendary lost cloak of Caladonis, as whoever wears this cloak becomes invulnerable to physical attacks. Now, some of you may be thinking this sounds very similar to a legendary treasure from Greek mythology, and if you're thinking that, you are correct. Not only is the Cloak of Caladonis inspired by the Golden Fleece, but this comic also contains a multi-headed Hydra, which makes this comic directly inspired by the story of Jason and the Argonauts. This makes this one of my personal favorite comics, as I love Jason and the Argonauts, specifically the 1963 movie that is widely remembered for the incredible special effects done by Ray Harryhausen. If you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it, as it was a direct inspiration for the cursed skeleton pirates in The Curse of the Black Pearl, which were based on the Children of the Hydra's Teeth from the end of Jason and the Argonauts. But the story of Jason and the Argonauts, for those unfamiliar, is essentially a quest revolving around Jason sailing to the island of Colchis to retrieve the Golden Fleece, which is a magical fleece of a ram that has magical properties like healing powers, and it can also be used for protection. And once he finds the fleece, he must defeat the creature guarding it, which is a Hydra with multiple heads. While the original story of Jason and the Argonauts depicts the creature more as a dragon than a Hydra, the 1963 movie uses a Hydra, which is probably why this comic features a Hydra guarding the Cloak of Caladonis. But with all that background out of the way, let's read the comic here and see what happens. Alright, so the comic begins with Jack saying, "There it is, lads! The legendary tree of, it's quite a legendary tree, and upon its branches, the equally legendary Cloak of Caladonis. Anyone who wears the cloak is supposed to be completely invulnerable to physical attack." And Gibbs says, "It's real. I can hardly believe it." And Jack says, "It seems to me there was more to the legend, but I can't quite remember." And we see behind him one of the heads of the Hydra. And then Gibbs yells out, "A many-headed serpent guards the tree." And Jack says, "That's it, Gibbs. How did you know?" And Jack turns around and sees the Hydra, and he says, "Oh, that's how." And Cotton's parrot calls out, "Abandon ship!" And Marty says, "Face a beast like that for a bit of fancy clothing?" And Gibbs yells, "Not a chance! Run!" And Jack yells out, "Oh, come on now. It's just a little garden snake. Are you bloodthirsty pirates? Or frightened children?" And all the pirates are like, a bit of both maybe? And one of the pirates says, "Children. I say children." But Jack gets them ready for battle, and he says, "Come then. Take what you can." And Gibbs yells, "Give nothing back." And they all charge at the Hydra. And Jack says, "Ha! Take that! And this! And some more of this!" And Gibbs says, "Have you lost your mind, Jack? You're fighting the tree." And Jack says, "Aye, and I'm winning too." "Aha! I caught you with your guard down." And he chops the tree, and all the pirates begin to run away. But the tree falls down right on top of the Hydra, and Jack grabs the branch with the cloak and says, "Ha ha! Look, Gibbs, the cloak is ours." And Gibbs says, "Amazing." But then the Hydra snatches the cloak right out of Jack's hand and says, "Correction, the cloak is the serpent's." And Jack runs away and yells, "Back to the ship." And Gibbs says, "But the cloak, you said to stand our ground." And Jack says, "Forget it. There's no way we can beat the serpent. Come on, there must be easier ways to make a fortune." And then soon after, we see the whole crew back on the Black Pearl sailing away. And Jack says, "Cheer up, lads. We didn't exactly run away empty-handed. We've got a branch from yon legendary tree. There are those who believe that if you hold out such a branch, it will point the way to a treasure even more valuable than the ratty old cloak." And Gibbs says, "Another legend?" And Jack says, "Look, the branch is pointing. There's treasure just waiting for us. Come on, who's with me?" And Cotton's parrot says, "Here we go again." And Gibbs says, "I wonder what part of this legend Jack is forgetting." And that is the end of Legends Lost. So I love this comic and the connections it has to Jason and the Argonauts. I think it's super cool, and I would love to know where the idea for this comic originated, because it's such a cool way to honor that mythology, but also put the unique Pirates of the Caribbean spin on it. Jack and the crew unfortunately lose the cloak to the Serpent, but they get away to live another day and look for an even greater treasure. Such a fun comic, and one of my favorites because of the Jason connection. But next up we have The Eye of Despair, which appeared in the October 2007 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine. This one revolves around a mysterious pirate named Captain John Strike, who leads Jack Sparrow and his crew through the Sea of Despair to find something with a very fitting name, that being The Eye of Despair. So let's dive into this comic. So the comic begins with some narration, and it says, "Somewhere in the aptly named Sea of Despair, the Black Pearl braves high winds and rough waters." And one of the pirates on Jack's crew says, "The ship can't survive this pounding for long. We'll be torn apart." And then we see John Strike, and he says, "Have courage, men. The Sea of Despair will fight us all the way, but if every man aboard does his part, nothing can stop the Black Pearl. Now make fast the topgallants and haul on the main braces." And Gibbs says, "Listen to him, Jack. Captain Strike really knows what he's doing." And Jack says, "Aye, but he's doing it on my ship." And Gibbs says, "You did agree to let Strike guide the ship to the Grotto of Despair and its fabled treasure." And Jack says, "Guide, yes, but give orders?" And Strike says, "Of course, do forgive me, Jack. And just what are your orders?" And Jack says, And Strike says, "Helm 2 points to starboard, perhaps?" And Jack says, "Helm 2 points to starboard." And Strike continues and says, "And keep the bow pointing to the wind?" And Jack says, "I ordered that our bow kept pointing into the wind. I think it's clear to everyone who's really in charge around here." And Gibbs says, "Aye, that's for sure." And Strike says, "Take heart, lads. Think about the treasure." And all the pirates cheer. And Jack says, "If you need me, I'll be in my cabin, the captain's cabin." And Strike continues and says, "It's just waiting for us in the Grotto of Despair, and we'll be there by nightfall." And the crew says, "3 cheers for Captain Strike." And we then go into the cabin where Jack is kind of sulking, and a crab appears out of nowhere and starts to talk to Jack. So the crab says, "Jack Sparrow, you must not trust the one you know as Captain John Strike. Him an old enemy of mine, a most evil man." And Jack says, "Say, weren't you part of my lunch?" And the crab says, "Appearances can be deceiving, Jack. Watch out for Strike. Him not what he seems. Neither am I." And Jack says, "Actually, you appear like you'd be delicious dipped in butter." And the crab says, "Look for the Eye of Despair." And Jack finally realizes what's going on, and he says, "Wait, I know that voice. Teodalma, is that you?" And Jack runs out of his cabin and says, "I was right to be suspicious of Strike. You can't trust a pirate who always seems to know what he's doing." "Stop! Stop the ship this instant!" And Strike says, "We have stopped, Jack. Welcome to the Grotto of Despair." And Jack says, "It's a trap, I tell you. Strike is pure evil." And Strike says, "Don't be absurd, Jack. Keep thinking about that treasure." And Gibbs asks Jack, "What makes you say that, Jack?" And Jack says, "If you must know, a crab told me. A very reliable crab." And one of the crewmates says, "Crab?" And Jack says, "Yes, and that must be the Eye of Despair. You see, it's all just as the crab predicted. Turn this ship around. That's an order." And Strike says, "You're free men. Choose your own destiny, flight or fortune." And then we see all the pirates loading into boats, even Gibbs. And Jack says, "Wrong choice, you greedy traitors. You'll be sorry you didn't listen to me and my crab." And Gibbs says, "Sorry, Jack. It's nothing personal." And then we go inside the Grotto of Despair, and the pirates and John Strike find the treasure. And Gibbs says, "That must be it." And Strike says, "Yes, indeed. Inside that chest lies the legendary treasure of the grotto." And Gibbs says, "And it's all ours." And Strike then says, "No, you fool." And the little red amulet that he's been wearing this whole time begins to glow. And Strike then says, "It's mine." And he unleashes his powers with this amulet thing he's wearing. And all the pirates are then encased in essentially rock prisons. And Cotton's parrot yells out, "Shiver me timbers!" And Gibbs says, "Aye, Cotton, it appears Jack was right about Strike." And Strike opens the chest and grabs the rest of the Eye of Despair. And he says, "The Eye of Despair! I have the entire gem at last. Now I only need to choose a sacrifice for the pit." And we see that the little amulet he's been wearing is the last piece of the Eye of Despair. But out of nowhere we see Jack finally comes in, and Gibbs says, "It's Captain Jack! He's come to rescue us!" And Jack says, "I heard there was going to be a sacrifice. I wonder who he has in mind. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a legendary treasure to collect." And Strike says, "Let the ancient ritual begin." And Jack points his sword at Strike and says, "Actually, mate, I think this is where the sword fighting begins." And so Strike and Jack begin to fight, and Strike says, "Sparrow, I thought you were the only one with the good sense not to follow me in such an obvious trap." And Jack says, "Good sense? Me? You don't know who you're dealing with." And Strike says, "No, you're the one who doesn't know who you are dealing with." And Jack says, "Well, now you're just repeating everything I say." And Jack cuts off the amulet from Strike's neck. And Jack says, "Well, well, looks can be deceiving." And we see Strike essentially transforms into this hideous creature version of himself. And he says, "Now you see the hideous price I've paid for dabbling in dark magic. That sliver of ruby gave me the illusion of my former appearance. The whole gem will restore it permanently." And Jack says, "If you're so ashamed of the way you look, why not just hide yourself?" And he kicks Strike right into the treasure chest. And he says, "This big old chest will be perfect for that." And the rest of the Eye of Despair falls down into the pit. And Jack closes the chest and locks it up. And we hear Strike yelling from inside. And he says, "Curse you, Sparrow! Let me out of here!" And Jack says, "I give the orders, remember? You're confined to your new quarters. Forever." And Gibbs says, "Jack, that ruby must have been worth a fortune." And Jack says, "A sacrifice for the pit, I'm afraid. But you're not trapped in a cave anymore, and that's got to be worth something." And Gibbs says, "Aye, I suppose it is. Back to the ship, lads." And Jack, of course, he still has the small piece of the Eye of Despair that Strike wore around his neck. And Jack says, "Of course, a small part of the ruby should be worth a small fortune." And as they all leave the cave, we hear Strike yelling from inside the chest, "This isn't over. You'll pay for this, Jack Sparrow." And Jack says, "Oh, I'll be paying for quite a few things, thanks to you. Farewell, Strike. Now you are the treasure of the Grotto of Despair." And Gibbs and the rest of the crew then cheer, "3 cheers for Captain Jack." And that is the end of the Eye of Despair. So this one is a cool little adventure, and we get introduced to the character of John Strike, who is revealed to have dabbled in dark magic and is apparently an old enemy of Teodalma. A pretty cool villain, and him transforming into like a monster version of himself was super cool to see. But Strike is easily defeated by Jack, and Strike is left locked inside of a chest in the Grotto of Despair, so a fitting fate for an evil pirate. But let's move on to the next comic, which is another one that I love a lot. This one is called The Challenge, and it appeared in the Disney Adventures magazine, specifically the quarter-annual version of the magazine named Comic Zone. These special issues released in the spring, summer, fall, and winter of each year, and as the name suggests, they were made up almost entirely of comics. The Challenge appeared in the summer 2007 issue of the Disney Adventures magazine Comic Zone, and it also appeared in the 14th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in June of 2008. But this was one of 3 Pirates comics featured in the summer 2007 issue, and I have owned this magazine issue ever since 2007. So these last 3 comics we're covering today do hold a very special place in my heart. But the challenge takes place during At World's End, specifically after Will, Elizabeth, Barbossa, and the rest of the crew leave Singapore aboard the Hai Peng, which if you are unaware is the name of that junk ship they sail on to Davy Jones' locker. And this comic is essentially about Will and Elizabeth accepting a test that proves you are a real pirate, which is proposed to them by Pintel and Rigetti. So let's read through this one. So the comic begins with Will and Elizabeth minding their own business, doing the chores aboard the Haipeng, and Elizabeth says, "Will, I think those two bilge rats are staring at us." And Will says, "Lots of rats on this ship." And we see Pintel and Ragetti laughing to each other, and Ragetti says, "They don't know about the test, do they, Pintel?" And Pintel says, "Apparently they do not. Haha." And then we see some narration that says, "Aboard the Chinese ship Haipeng, Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann search for Jack Sparrow alongside Captain Barbossa and his crew." And Pintel says, "Any man or woman who wants to be one of us has to prove they've got what it takes." And Ragetti says, "You have to pass the test." And Will says, "Oh, please, what nonsense." And Barbossa says, "Ah, but they're right, Mr. Turner. It's a little known part of the pirate code that I'd hoped we could overlook. Now a challenge has been issued, and you must pass the test, or it's over the side with you both." And Elizabeth asks Pintel, "And what kind of test do you have in mind for us?" And Pintel says, "It's a trial so difficult, so dangerous, that many an able pirate has run away in fear rather than even try to..." And Ragetti butts in and says, "What he means is, you have to cook a delicious lamb stew with rosemary and sage." And Pintel says, "What? Have you gone soft in the head, Ragetti? That's not a pirate test." And Ragetti says, "But I love lamb stew." And Pintel says to him, "A pirate test has to be something really hard." And Ragetti says, "You try finding rosemary and sage this far out at sea." And Pintel continues and says, "A proper test for a pirate would be to vanquish a sea monster, find buried treasure, or at least steal something from someone." And Will looks at Elizabeth and they smile, and Will says, "Shall we then?" And Elizabeth says, "Of course." And Will throws a sword over to Elizabeth, and she says to him, "I don't see any sea monsters, Will." And Will says, "Aye, and there's no treasure buried anywhere nearby. That leaves us with one option." And Pintel says, "Wait a minute, does that mean you're going to try and rob?" And Will throws his sword at Pintel's sword, which sticks it right to the mast, right out of Pintel's hand. And of course, Pintel now knows that they're going to try to rob him and Ragetti. And Will says, "Indeed it does." And Elizabeth cuts open Ragetti's pocket, and she says, "Is this how a real pirate would do it, Ragetti?" And we see a bunch of coins fall out of Ragetti's pocket. And then Will and Elizabeth then tie Pintel and Ragetti to the mast, but Ragetti says, "That's not fair." And Pintel says, "It certainly isn't." And Will says to them, "So, real pirates never fight fair." And Elizabeth says, "I'd say we've passed your test." And Barbossa says, "Indeed you have. Welcome to the crew, both of you. Truly, you are worthy pirates." And then he goes over to Pintel and Ragetti and he says, "But I'm beginning to have my doubts about you two. Give me one good reason I shouldn't toss you over the side." And Ragetti says, "Well, I could cook you a nice lamb stew. There are some seaweed that tastes exactly like rosemary and sage." And Pintel says, "Of course, you'll have to untie us for that." And Barbossa says, And there we see a nice wide shot of the Haipeng. And Pintel says, "You are going to untie us, aren't you, Captain? Captain? Where are you going?" And that is the end of the challenge. So this is a short one, but it is really great. And it is a nice comic with Will and Elizabeth working together, which, while fun, doesn't really make sense with where they are at this point in time in At World's End. At this point in the movie, if you remember, they're barely communicating with each other at all. So them working together this well makes this comic hard to believe with what we know from the movie. However, despite that, it is a very fun comic nonetheless, and we also get some really fun moments with Pintel and Ragetti as well, along with Barbossa. So all in all, another fantastic comic and one that I love a lot. But now we're going to move on to The Dragon Tile. This can also be found in the summer 2007 Disney Adventures Comic Zone issue, and it also appears in the 6th issue of the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine in July 2007. This one is a longer comic, about 12 pages, and is essentially Jack Sparrow recounting one of his adventures in Singapore to find, well, the Dragon Tile, the namesake of the comic. This is another great one, and it is super, super fun, so let's dive into it. So the comic starts out with Jack saying, "Do you like stories? Stories that sound quite impossible, yet are almost certainly true. Stories filled with adventure, excitement, danger, and lots of exploding things? If you do, then gather round, because Captain Jack is going to tell you the completely incredible story of The Dragon Tile. Like so many incredible stories, this one begins in Singapore, behind the impenetrable walls of the legendary fortress known as Cheng's Castle. And we begin with two servants named Shan and Jing, two sisters. Jing says, "Are you nervous, Shan?" And Jing says, "Quiet, we're almost there." And they both go into a room, and one of the guards says, "Clean the room quickly, and remember, you'll be searched when you leave." And once the guard leaves, Jing and Shan are alone. And Shan says, "Guard the door, Jing. Hurry." And they open up a little secret passage in the wall, and out pops Jack Sparrow. And he says, "If there's one thing I love to find at the end of a secret passage, it's a beautiful woman." And Jing says, "Hello, Jack." And Jack comes out into the room and he says, "And if there's another thing I love to find at the end of a secret passage, it's a fabulous treasure, such as yon priceless dragon tile. You've impressed me, ladies." And Shan says, "Thank you, Jack, but remember, that tile may have defenses we aren't aware of." And Jack says, "Nonsense," and he grabs the tile right off the wall. And he says, "Considering how difficult it is to get inside the castle, there's no reason for them to bother with it any further." And then he sees a fuse begins to light where the dragon tile was originally sitting. And Jack says, "Does anyone else smell gunpowder? Get back!" And there's a large explosion. And Jack and Shan and Jing take cover behind the pillar as the whole wall essentially explodes. And Jack says, "Why can't it be easy? Just once." And then the guards rush in and they yell, "Thieves! Raise the alarm! Halt!" And Jack says, "I'd be happy to halt, just as soon as I reach some place that is not currently in the process of exploding." And Jack makes his way to the window and says, "Drop that! You might hurt yourself, or at worse yet, me." And he knocks a gun right out of one of the guards' hands. And he says, "I'm just going to take your gunpowder for safekeeping." And he grabs the sack of gunpowder from the other guard. And Jack smashes through the window and says, "And take advantage of this handy escape route." And he looks down and sees a massive cliff drop off with a river down in the darkness. And he says, not so handy after all. But with no other choice, Jack jumps off and says, "Farewell, gentlemen. As a pirate, I must take my chances with the sea." And Jack dives down into the water. He says to himself, obviously because he's in the water, "Must avoid the rocks." And then he sees sea monsters in the water, and they come swimming for him. And he says, "No, must avoid the sea monsters. Explosions weren't enough. There just had to be sea monsters as well. Hello, what's this?" And he sees a chain in the water, and he grabs hold of it. And Jack emerges from the water, escaping the sea monsters. And one of the people on the ship hauling him up says, of course, "Haul him up." And Jack says, "Haul quickly, men." And he kicks one of the sea monsters away as they're hauling him up. And once Jack is on board the ship, one of the crewmen says, well, what kind of fish are you?" And Jack says, "Let's just skip the joke, shall we? I have the tile, so take me to Sao Fang." And then, of course, we are on board the Empress now, and Jack is talking to Sao Fang. And Sao Fang says, "No one has ever made it out of Cheng's castle alive. You are always a surprise to me, Jack Sparrow." And Jack says, "I'm always a bit of a surprise to me, too. But never mind that now. Let's get down to business. I believe we'd settled on a price for a certain priceless little tile." Sao Fang then says, "Yes, the map to the golden island of Penglai. It is yours. And with this tile, my collection is complete." And Jack says, "How nice for you, then." And Sao Fang says, "And I now become absolute ruler of the 7 seas. And Jack says, "What a funny thing. You didn't say anything about that before. So you get to be absolute ruler of the 7 seas, and I get nothing." And Jack opens up the tube, which was supposed to contain a map, but he sees it is empty. And Sao Fang and his crew point all their weapons at Jack, and Sao Fang says, "Indeed. You see, I have my surprises too, Jack." Then Jack says, "But we have an even more surprising surprise for you, Sao Fang. Drop your weapons." And we see some of Sao Fang's crew mutiny Sao Fang and joins Jack's side, which was part of Jack's plan to begin with. And Sao Fang says, "A mutiny? Are you really fool enough to throw in your lot with Jack Sparrow, Wong?" And Wong says, "Of course not. Once all the tiles are mine, I will have no need for either of you." And Jack says, "That's one surprise too many for my taste." And Wong and his pirates say, "Surrender, Sao Fang." And Sao Fang says, "Never." And Jack says, "I'm inclined to let you two fight it out for the rest of the tiles. But the dragon tile is mine." And he grabs it from Sao Fang. And Jack says, "You never paid me, remember?" And Xiao Feng then begins to chase after Jack, and he says, "Out of my way, fools! Stop right there, Sparrow!" And he points his pistol at Jack, and Jack says, "Gladly. And since I'm conveniently standing next to the ship's rail, I think I'll drop this tile into the waves." And Xiao Feng says, "You wouldn't dare." And Jack says, "I wouldn't have taken it in the first place if I'd known what you were really planning." And then we see Xiao Feng's crew is yelling out, "Captain, help us!" And Xiao Feng says, "Not now." And Jack says, "Actually, now would be a good time." And then we see the sea monsters from earlier are now on board the Empress, and apparently we find out that the guardians of Cheng's castle, as one of the crewmen says. But they yell, "Sea monsters! Guardians of Cheng's castle!" And in the craziness, Jack looks over the rail and sees his sword and the sack of gunpowder. And he says, "At least Wang's men hid my sword where I wanted it." And he throws the sack of gunpowder and says, "Catch!" And right at the moment where Xiao Feng fires his pistol and says, "No more tricks!" And of course, Xiao Feng accidentally hits the sack of gunpowder Jack threw at him, which of course results in a massive explosion aboard the Empress, sending Jack over the side. And Xiao Feng yells out, "Sparrow! Gone! And the dragon tile with him!" And we see Jack in the water now being chased by more of the sea monsters. And he thinks to himself, "Here we go again. I have the dragon tile. If I found the others, I could be ruler of the 7 seas. And my first act would be to outlaw sea monsters. But no one should be able to have all of that for themselves." And Jack lets go of the dragon tile. And he thinks to himself, "Go on, chase the tile. Let the inky depths swallow you along with it." And a little later, Jack emerges from the ocean, and he says, "Ah, I don't think I've ever drawn a sweeter breath of air in all my life. And the sight of Xiao Feng's ship ablaze makes it sweeter still." And we see Xiao Feng on the Empress yelling, "Put that fire out, you mutinous dogs! We must search for Sparrow and the dragon tile." And then we go to present day, or present day as in right before the maelstrom happens in At World's End. And Jack says, "He never found me, of course. And that is the end of my little story." And Ragetti says, "Amazing, Jack. And you say it's all true?" And Jack says, "I do say that, yes. But just look where we are now. All the pirate lords have banded together to defeat another scoundrel who wants to rule the seas as his own. Some things never change, I'm afraid." And Ragetti and Pintel ask, "What happened to the girls, the ones who helped you?" And Jack says, "Ah, Shan and Jing." And then we see right behind Jack is another Chinese ship pulling up with Shan and Jing on board. And they yell out, "Ahoy, Jack!" And Jack says they escaped from Cheng's castle and traded their lives of servitude for the freedom of the sea, for as long as that lasts anyway. And that is the end of the Dragon Tile. So I love this comic, particularly because it's the only one to actually feature Xiao Feng. And this comic shows us yet another reason why Xiao Feng hates Jack Sparrow's guts. But this comic really has it all: a daring break-in to a well-guarded fortress, a bombastic escape, sea monsters, mutinies, and more. And the ending is great too, as obviously at the beginning, we have Jack beginning to tell his story to what is presumed to be the reader, but we see at the end he's actually telling the story to Pintel and Ragetti. And not only that, we see they're actually waiting with the rest of the Brethren Court's fleet for the East India Trading Company Armada to arrive. I think this is such a cool way to end it, as it happens right before the biggest battle in the franchise. What is even cooler is that we also get to see the 2 servants from Cheng's castle, the sisters named Shan and Jing. We see them at the end of the comic as pirates, which is super cool. What I love most about these comics are the numerous side characters they introduce, as it really does flesh out the world so much and makes it feel so much more lived in. While we only see Shan and Jing briefly in this comic, they do make a lasting impression, at least to me, and I would love to see what they get up to in their pirate careers. But that brings us to the final comic we're covering today, which is named Beast Ship, and this is the 3rd and final comic found in the summer 2007 Comic Zone issue of the Disney Adventures magazine. And this is also the last comic that features a corresponding action figure 2-pack in the Secrets of the Deep Wave. The action figure version of the comic is called The Journey of Will Turner, and the action figures in that pack are a sea-slimed Will Turner and a variant Davy Jones figure where he's not actually wearing his coat. Pretty cool figures, and you can probably get a decent idea of what happens in this comic from the 2 figures in that pack. The comic also takes place during one of the movies, specifically Dead Man's Chest, And when during Dead Man's Chest does this comic take place? Well, it is actually set right after the Kraken attack that destroys the Edinburgh Trader in the movie. And if you remember what happens after that, Will stows away on the Flying Dutchman in the maw of the figurehead of the ship. So the Flying Dutchman is now bound for Isla Cruces, and this comic is about what Will experiences on the way there. So let's get into it. So the comic begins with Davy Jones shouting orders to his crew, and he says, "Crowd on the sail! I'll have more speed, Macus." And Macus says, "No ship can outrun the Flying Dutchman against the wind, Captain. We're sure to reach Isla Cruces before Will Turner finds your chest." And Davy Jones says, "My heart is in that chest, Macus. My own beating heart. Get us there first or we'll all be sorry." And then we go down to Will, who is down in the maw of the figurehead, and he says, "Yes, pour on the speed, Davy Jones. The faster you get to Isla Cruces, the faster I'll get there too." And then Will begins to make his way across the hull of the ship. And he says, "I can't wait to get off this monstrous vessel." And Will happens to accidentally grab onto a sea serpent that camouflages with the hull of the Flying Dutchman. And he wakes up the sea serpent and, of course, falls off the Flying Dutchman. But Will is with this sea serpent as the Flying Dutchman begins to sail away. And Will says, "I wanted off that ship, but not like this." And now the sea serpent is, of course, chasing him. And Will says, "This forest of seaweed is my only chance." And Will makes his way into the seaweed, which actually traps the serpent. And Will thinks to himself, "Too close." And then he surfaces from the water, and he says, "Saved by a strand of seaweed." But he then goes back down and thinks to himself, "I wonder how long the seaweed can hold him, and what happens if I'm holding on to it?" But Will gets his answer almost immediately, and the sea serpent tries to wriggle itself out of the seaweed. And Will thinks to himself, "This may turn out to be the worst idea I've ever had." But soon after, we see Will and the sea serpent emerge from the water, and the sea serpent is making its way back to the Flying Dutchman, with Will sitting on its back, using the seaweed as reins. And he says, "It's actually working. Wait until I tell Jack. This is even more outrageous than strapping a pair of sea turtles to your feet. There's the Dutchman. Swim, my slithery beast. I'll beat Davy Jones to Isla Cruces yet." And then we go back over to the Flying Dutchman, and Davy Jones says, "I see our stray serpent is returning." And Macus says, "Ship ahoy! Shall we summon the Kraken to recruit more sailors for our crew?" But Davy Jones says to Macus, "No, let the serpent have a little fun with them on its way back to us." And then Will is still on the serpent, of course, and he says, "Why are you turning? No, you can't. Not those sailors. Leave them be." And the serpent grabs the sailors by their shirts in its mouth, and Will says, "Two more unlucky sailors for delivery into Davy Jones' slimy clutches, eh? Well, I say, not today." And he cuts the sailors loose from the creature's jaw, and Will says, "Turn away. We will go to Isla Cruces, I tell you. We will go right back to the Flying Dutchman, blast it." And Macus looks over the side and says, "I thought the serpent had 3 sailors in its jaws, but there's no sign of them, Captain." And Davy Jones says, "No matter. The chest is all that concerns us now, and it is almost within our grasp." And the Dutchman crew begins to laugh, and we go down to Will, who is, of course, back on the Flying Dutchman, and he says, "I can't wait to get off this monstrous vessel. Again." And that is the end of Beast Ship. So this is another comic that I love a lot, obviously since it features Will Turner. But I read this one many, many times as a kid, so it does hold a special place in my heart. But what we find out in this comic is that apparently the Flying Dutchman has a sea serpent that can blend into the hull of the ship and wake up to just cause havoc whenever it wants. Super interesting concept, and it honestly reminds me of the Silent Mary and its corresponding ghost sharks from Dead Men Tell No Tales. But besides that, there isn't really much else to this one, but it is super fun regardless. And hey, how many other people can say they've ridden on the back of a sea serpent? Well, Will Turner can say that now, and that is pretty cool. I love how Will even mentions how it's more ridiculous than strapping sea turtles to your feet, and how he can't wait to tell Jack, so I love that part of it. But that is the final comic we are covering in this episode. But don't worry, we still have 12 more comics to cover in the next episode, and while some of them do appear in the Disney Adventures magazine, most of them are honestly attributed more so to the Pirates of the Caribbean magazine, with a lot of them actually being exclusive to that magazine. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I have gone through scans of all of those comics, and done a full English translation of them, since, as I said, a lot of those were never printed in English, and I tried to stay as close to the original text in them as possible, but also trying to make the dialogue feel a bit more in character for Jack and the other characters in those comics. I'll talk more about this whole project in the next episode, but for now, thank you for listening. All of these comics mean a lot to me, and I feel like they don't get enough love, and I also just want to take a moment to highlight the Disney Adventures magazine. Unfortunately, the Disney Adventures magazine itself no longer exists, as it was announced on August 21st, 2007, that the magazine would have its last issue that November. But it did have a great run, as the magazine launched in 1990 and ran all the way to 2007. It really is a relic of its time now, and that's why I'm so thankful for people who archive these magazine issues and these comics, as it is a great time capsule looking back at these issues and seeing the events on the issue's monthly calendar and the movies, TV shows, and music that was releasing at the time. I highly recommend looking through some archived issues if you haven't ever experienced the Disney Adventures magazine, as it is very nostalgic for me and lots of other people who grew up in the 90s or early 2000s. Definitely check out the Disney Adventures Mailbox archive, as I'll have the website linked in the description of this episode if you want to check out the issues and comics they have archived on that site. Obviously, we focused on the Pirates of the Caribbean comics here today, but the magazine also had comics about Kim Possible, Lilo and Stitch, Mulan, and countless other Disney properties of the time period. There were even a few Scarecrow of Romney Marsh comics too, which are super cool, and if you don't know who that is, go listen to the bonus episode I did covering the Enter the Scarecrow comic for more info about that. But that will do it for this episode of Podcast of the Caribbean. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for rating or reviewing the podcast if you've been kind enough to do so. It really does mean a lot to me. I've only gotten to this point because of all of your support, so thank you all once again for getting this podcast to last over 3 years now. It has been one of my goals of this podcast to talk about these comics at some point, and we finally got to the point where I can talk about them, and it's a really good feeling for me especially. So thank you so much. I will see you all next time to talk about even more Pirates of the Caribbean comics, but until then, take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X and Bluesky at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia over there, so make sure to check those platforms out. And you can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic and Dashery. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.